Hello, thank you for joining me. Today we are going to be talking about Andrew Jackson. As you may well know, Andrew Jackson was our 7th President of the United States, and he is currently the face on our $20 bill. Some things you may not know about Andrew Jackson: his parents were immigrants, he fought in the American Revolutionary War, both of his brothers and his mom died during the war, and he was actually a prisoner of the British during the war as well. He is what you could call a political machine. Before becoming president, he was a lawyer, an attorney general, a judge, a governor, a congressman. He was in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. And he was a war hero as well. He accomplished many things during his presidency, and he also was a very controversial figure in U.S. history as well. Jackson was one of the elite planters of cotton in the United States, which means he owned several slaves. Some say more than a couple hundred. He sparked a controversial argument between the state's power and the federal government's power. This was an argument that led pretty much right up until the Civil War. And our main topic today, the policy of Indian removal. Before we get into the details of these policies, it's important that we look at these events with an historical context. Like all events, we don't look at these events this way to defend actions. We look at these this way to understand what times were like, what the agendas were, and how society justified these actions. This is important to understand how things evolve, and also to understand the cause and effect, and to know that things are never that simple. Indian removal was not something that Jackson started. This was something that started all the way back with George Washington. Thomas Jefferson dealt with it. And legislation goes as far back as 1802. You have to understand that during this time, people were still dueling with single shot pistols. We were still traveling on dirt roads. Slavery was rampant. The U.S. was just beginning to expand west. People were still fighting wars on wooden boats with cannons and private militias. And at this time, it took over a month to travel from Jackson's home state of Tennessee to Washington, D.C. A little bit of a background in how we got to Indian removal. This is a dispute over land that encompassed parts of North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. And the U.S. government wanted this land, and they wanted the Cherokees to be out. And this isn't something new. History is filled with conflicts and disputes and battles over land rights. It still happens today in 2019. And just like, most things, this isn't something that happened overnight. The Cherokee settled these lands starting as far back as the year 600. They farmed, they gathered, and hunted these lands. And the Europeans first started encroaching on them in the late 1500s. And upon this interaction with the British is when their cultures began to change. The British wanted deer skins, and the Native Americans started trading deer skins for goods. And the more they traded, the more they became dependent on these European goods and less dependent on themselves. And also, it's important to know that during the American Revolutionary War, the Cherokees flip-flopped between sides. They fought both for the U.S. and the British, and during this war, they lost many homes. A lot of their land was destroyed. Many deaths occurred to not just their tribe members, but a lot of their tribal leaders as well. And following the Revolutionary War, the U.S. designed what was called Civilized Policy Acts. This was a way to force the Cherokee to adapt to Western policies and cultures. They were required to adapt agricultural methods, build homes. Some of them even owned slaves. They were to attend Western-style schools, practice Christianity, adopt law codes, build public facilities, design court systems, and they eventually even ended up printing newspapers. So think about that. For over 1,000 years or more, this hunter and gatherer society now had to farm, look, dress, speak English, and act American. Print newspapers and go to church. I mean, imagine what that was like. I mean, pretty much they had to change, almost their entire way of living. And during this time, there were some politicians that started arguing that change was too slow and something else had to be done. So forward to around 1817, this was when Andrew Jackson started to kind of come into this. He was a general at the time, and he was in the middle of the Seminole Wars. And he was stated with saying that treaties were ineffective and the Cherokee needed to be removed from these lands. And I mean, you can see he was a general, so he was a very influential figure at this time, and a decorated war hero. And the current president, James Monroe, actually argued against his viewpoint, and Jackson couldn't draw enough support at the time to force this removal. So this started a contradictory time. The Cherokee started feeling pressure, and they kind of started to get involved a little bit. They started petitioning and sending delegates to Washington. And at this time, Monroe tried to make them, feel assured that they weren't going to lose their land and they weren't going to have to go anywhere. And even though he felt this way, he didn't produce any sort of legislation or laws or anything that had a real effect on allowing them to keep their land. Cherokees started even working with Christian groups and other missionary groups to help them defend their land. They would help them send delegates to Washington. They would help them send letters expressing their concerns. And this went on for years. We can forward to 1820. The U.S. government started floating ideas around that they would attempt to convince the Cherokees to leave their land instead of forcing removal. Some agreed, but most people wanted to stay on their land. And around 1823, there was a letter sent back to them in response from our Secretary of War, John Calhoun, who responded, "You must be sensible that it will be impossible for you to remain for any length of time in your present situation as a distinct society or nation within the limits of Georgia or any other state." And I think this is important to understand because I feel like this was the way that not only politics were heading, but this was the general census in America was, it was their land and they didn't want people there. They were going to have to leave. And then we'll see, later on that this is, what not everyone, but the majority of people felt. So we fast forward to 1828. Time was running out. They were printing newspapers at the time and missionary materials, passing them out to the public, trying to stand on a moral platform to try to get other people behind them, which it was all in vain. A few months later, Jackson was voted as president, and there was news that people were now discovering gold in Cherokee territory. So between Andrew Jackson and the news of gold being discovered, these two factors together would speed this process up. And in 1929, Andrew Jackson was voted as president, and in his first public address to America, he started basically, advocating his agenda that, these savages, he called them, needed to be civilized and they needed to be able to live among the whites. And he was promoting this whole idea of them moving to Oklahoma and having freedom and being able to make their own choices and prosper. And as we know, this was, a very contradictory statement because, what options was he really giving them, and how does forcing somebody to leave their homeland allow them to prosper? It doesn't really, but... So around the same time, Georgia, the state of Georgia, was also pursuing ways to get them to leave. In 1830, Jackson passed a voluntary removal act. Some left, but most people stayed. And a month later, Georgia passed a law saying that anyone that lived on Cherokee land had to obey Georgia laws. So now the state of Georgia and Andrew Jackson were aggressively working together to provide legislation to remove the Cherokees. Georgia, around this time, started selling the land. And then soon after that, they passed a law, the state of Georgia passed a law requiring that all white people that lived in Cherokee territory had to take an oath to the state of Georgia. And if you didn't, you would be arrested and put in jail. And there were several people that were arrested and put in jail and then basically forced to sign an oath, and then they would be released. Except for one man, Samuel Worcester, who was a white missionary living among the Cherokee. He was arrested, released, went back, wouldn't take the oath, arrested again, and eventually his case went to the Georgia Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of Worcester and ordered for him to be released. And Andrew Jackson basically said no, he was the president and he didn't have to follow the rulings of the Supreme Court. So we had a president saying that no, you guys pass things and I don't have to listen to what you say, which obviously was a very controversial thing at that time, or at any time for that matter. But Worcester stayed in jail, and Jackson and the state of Georgia continued with their agenda. In 1832, people started showing up to claim the land that they bought. And the Cherokee were still there. They wouldn't leave. So the military started making a presence on the land. And then over the next few years, the military presence would increase. And they, essentially built a small base on Cherokee land. They built homes, they ran military drills, they operated essentially like a small army base. They were there specifically to intimidate and eventually escort the Cherokee off their land. And then in 1835, Jackson signed a treaty with the Cherokee tribes in exchange for a large sum of money and a 2-year agreement that they would leave and go to Oklahoma, which was a designated land that the U.S. government designated to several Indian tribes in the early 1800s. And this wasn't an agreement that all Cherokees agreed on. It was a select few of tribal leaders, and most of the natives felt betrayed, and they attempted to petition, and these petitions failed. So, forward to the spring of 1838, the removal of over 13,000 native Indians began being forcefully removed from their land with a military escort. And this is today what we know to be the Trail of Tears. They basically started rounding people up, and they would force them out a few hundred at a time. And it wasn't, a nice way of doing things. It was get up, get your stuff, and get out. And they could only take what they basically could carry. And as they were leaving, settlers were coming in to claim their new land. And this was the beginning of a 900-mile journey that took 9 months. I couldn't believe spending 9 months walking. Your families were split up. You had to endure the seasons. It was rough terrain, unstable conditions. Some attempted to escape. Some hid up in the mountains. But the majority of them kept along the trail, and they were basically forced to sleep in these internment camps, which were basically makeshift huts. They were not sanitary. They were unaccommodating for the elderly and the sick and the injured. And the number is not exact, but it's believed that over 4,000 of them died during this process of removal. And there were many causes of death. They were dehydrated. They were starving. They had colds, tuberculosis, smallpox. And it just was a brutal process, to say the least. This happened in 1831. Andrew Jackson was out of office for a year, but Van Buren was his handpicked successor, so it was already, going to happen regardless. And to sum it up, the U.S. went through a 30-year legal process to make this happen. And this was a very methodical and engineered process that went through all levels of government. And this wasn't just an isolated incident in Georgia. This happened all over the U.S. before and after 1838. And there were a lot of situations where Indians were given land, and it would be taken away. They were moved, and sometimes, after being moved and removed, that if this land was desirable or worth anything, they would have more land taken away from them, or they were moved somewhere else. And if you could imagine what this did to native lands, to families, to cultures and their traditions, a lot of it was eliminated. And it's, and as we know, American history has many of these social and political controversies. And as we can see with Indian policy of removal, political agendas often lack morality, and when you're not represented in these political systems, you are left with limited options and at the will to stronger forces. So to wrap it up, it's important to understand that this was only a brief overlook of these events, and unfortunately, this is a stain on American history. The Trail of Tears was awful. It lacked complete morality. I mean, no matter how you want to put it, it happened. But they condoned these actions and justified them with legislation and laws. And yeah, you could argue that it was eventually going to happen, and Andrew Jackson didn't do it himself. But as we can see, he was one of the driving forces behind this. It was one of his top priorities from day one, and he made sure that it was going to happen, and it happened. And so when we discuss Andrew Jackson and when we discuss other events throughout American history, it's important to remember that we view them within the proper context, and that we understand that things don't just happen overnight, and that we can't forget about these events because they've had some impact on who we are and who other people are. And if we wish to not repeat events like this, we digest them and we learn from them, and that's the best way to go about it. Thank you very much. I hope this wasn't too boring and you learned something.